Hi, I'm Jeff Nyquist, and this is another edition of Friends and Enemies. And I am in the United States. My co host, Alex Benesch, is in Germany, and we're going to be discussing, obviously the presidential debate, what it is that presidents do in national security, and what the National Security Council is all about, how all this is organized. Does the president, is he a one man show? Is he a king? What does he do? So, Alex, maybe you can begin to explain what you've prepared on the National Security Council of the United States.
All right, so yeah, it's almost a bit like comedy when you see people over here in Germany or other parts of Europe when they talk about the United States president and the presidency and the way decisions are made. So many people believe that a presidential election is like voting for a king. So you have a king for 4 years, and this king can do pretty much anything. And the king has to know everything, and he would be like making these decisions on military matters and economical matters and intelligence matters and whatnot. But the reality is, you're voting for a team, you're voting for a party, an apparatus, and there's many moving bits and pieces. And I tend to explain this to people a lot when there's an important event, something with the Iranians or the North Koreans or the Russians, anything important, the president gets a briefing. They explain to him what's going on, and they will present a menu of options to the president. So obviously, you have all these experts, and I have notes on a very specific expert that's pretty relevant to the situation right now. And so these people, these experts, they prepare for eventualities. They know something might come up with the North Koreans or the Iranians or whatever. So they prepare in advance a menu of options. And then the president can choose one of those options. They will debate these options, and so this is kind of how it works. And so it's easy to focus on a single person and his shortcomings and maybe the scandals and whatnot. But at the end of the day, it's a system, and it works in a specific way. So even when you saw the debate now, these political parties, they're trying to push their candidate over the finish line, and so what we saw with Biden, even if they manage to do that, which it doesn't look like they're going to achieve that, but if they do, everybody kind of understands that Biden would not really be running things because he can't. He's too old. He's done. He's over. And if Trump wins, there's going to be a team of people, managing these things. And I got some interesting notes here. I'm going to talk about them in a bit. This is a recent text published by Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg, and he served in different roles in the Trump admin years ago. National Security Council, he had a role in there, senior role. He was also acting National Security Advisor, and he wrote a very interesting piece here on the Trump admin foreign policy, how tough it was against the Nord Stream pipelines, against the Russians, the Iranians, a clear track record. And this is what Trump had actually announced when he ran in 2015, had a campaign in 2016. He gave this foreign policy speech and said, I want to be like Ronald Reagan. This is kind of what it sounded like to me. I want to be tough on foreign policy, no more of this mumbo jumbo. And this is exactly what happened in the Trump admin. So here's an example of a politician announcing something, and that actually happens. And so this Keith Kellogg guy writes about the comparison foreign policy. He writes about the Ukraine war, how it can or should realistically end, how tough the deal would have to be for the Russians. And this is Trump's guy. This is not some dude, commenting on this. This was Trump's man. And you can see sort of the expertise that we had during that era in that team. And this is something that even many Trump followers don't understand, or they got it all wrong. They understand it the wrong way around. They may have read on the internet that Trump has this sort of secret alliance with Putin, and they love the pipelines and they would do anything together. They got this all wrong, and now we got some really clear talk about um, about that. So yeah, this is kind of my short intro into this. Obviously, I saw the debate. You saw Biden mumbling, and this was his big chance. This was his way to prove he can still do it. They could prepare him. They could just remove things from his schedule beforehand, make sure he sleeps, make sure he gets some coffee in. Everything could be optimized for that event, and it all failed. So people have to realize Biden would never run the country.
Yeah, no, that's what people this week, because of Biden's performance in the debate, you maybe saw that he not just hesitated, but he got confused in a couple moments. Obviously he spent one issue that they all mentioned, that he spent an entire week out of his presidency to prepare for this debate by
A week.
memorizing statistics. Yeah, he spent a whole week at Camp David preparing. That's what the news media was saying, and of course. Trump was very sharp in his presentation, and focused. A lot of people thought that he had won the debate. On CNN, there were some people that were throwing Biden under the bus. They think that Biden is mentally impaired. He's not really fully functioning, and people have made these comments about him before. You saw him at this parachute demonstration where he wanders off, and the Italian prime minister kind of corrals him back as he's wandering off. Um, so Trump really came off looking better, and a lot of people, you've got names being dropped, mainly Governor Gavin Newsom of California and Governor Whitmer of Michigan, the state I'm in. Both states that I've lived in recently, the governors are the star candidates that would be coming up to replace. And but this is where the cleverness of Joe Biden as a politician comes in. Joe Biden is president now and is running for reelection because he picked the most obnoxious, the most hated, the most venal, the most, how would we say, well, there's a rumor that she drinks a lot, the Vice President Harris.
Hmm.
Um, and the Vice President, she's a lawyer from California. She was a senator from California. Before that, she was the state attorney general, if I'm remembering right. And of course, she never impressed me or probably anyone as being the brightest, sharpest tack in the box, right? She's not that bright. And then she is really, I understand she has trouble keeping staff. People hate to work for her.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, what you want to do if let's say you're Biden and you know that you have some problems, you're getting older, but you want to cling on. How do you make sure they don't use the 25th Amendment, which allows half the cabinet and the vice president to remove the president?
Right.
How do you prevent them from removing you if you're losing your mind? Well, you pick someone like Harris, someone who's hated, who's despised, who basically is on everybody's, um, a list of people that they don't like, and that's Harris. And of course, how are you going to get a majority of cabinet officials who might not have their jobs since they hate Harris, and Harris probably hates them back? How are you going to get them to agree to remove the president?
Yeah.
How are you going to you got to have, my understanding is you have to have a majority of the cabinet and the vice president to remove him. Well, of course, now will Harris remove him now? Harris won't remove him because she knows she'll be removed all the way from the
Mm-hmm.
ticket.
Oh, and
And so the best thing Harris can do is hope that he drops dead and she becomes president. And she's on the ticket as the vice president. See? Now, if he drops dead before the convention, it's an open convention. They can nominate anybody.
yeah.
So, and the convention is in August. So imagine this quandary here. And what was really a surprise, a lot of the news media here in the US, there was Biden, after this disastrous debate on Thursday night, Obama was coming to meet with Biden. And everybody thought, oh, he's going to have the sit down. He's going to have the talk with Biden and say, look, man, he just slaughtered you. You looked confused. I mean, he looked like a corpse. Let's be
Yep.
honest.
Yep.
He was pale. He looked like, he hadn't been fixed up for the funeral yet,
Mm-hmm.
right? So there he was, and not performing very well. So everybody thought Obama was going to tell him to resign or to let someone else
Hmm.
be, give up the thing. No, Biden comes out on Friday. He does this rally in North Carolina, and President Obama publicly makes a statement, not at the rally, but elsewhere, saying that he supports Joe Biden's the guy.
Really
And
weird.
the news media is like, all these people are lying about this guy's fitness. Why are they lying? Because Joe Biden set up his presidency with this gun to everyone's head. And that gun is Vice President Harris.
Oh boy. I mean, this is the reason why we don't have kings anymore. I mean, if people actually remember King George III, the enemy of George Washington, he was going loony for a while because of these hereditary genetic issues. I mean, if you marry your cousins for 1,000 years, that's bound to happen. So this was kind of a big debate back then, when King George III was going nuts and he wasn't functioning anymore. And the same problem happened in Imperial Russia with, I think, the last 2 or 3 czars. Because of the same hereditary issues, they were in their 40s. They were becoming unstable, and everybody was panicking. And this was an overall, this was a bad situation. And of course, we've learned from these things. That's why we have republics. That's why we have systems and structures to prevent that sort of chaos from happening. Or you explained this in previous episodes, I think so well with the last days or months of Stalin in Russia. When Stalin was becoming unable to run this whole thing and the scheming, and everybody was figuring out what to do next. Who would be the next guy, who would get thrown under the bus. We need to have a proper system.
The
And
last non-Russian, non-Soviet to see Stalin alive was the Indian ambassador.
really,
Yeah, and the whole time he met with Stalin, Stalin had a sketch pad. And you know what he was doing? He was sketching wolves.
oh no,
And he made a kind of a comment about, the wolves.
oh boy,
It's,
yeah.
and so Stalin was battling to the end, but he didn't outmaneuver Khrushchev. But yes, there is this struggle going on. If you go to the Atlantic in the November, I think it's in November or no, it's October 10th, 2023. The Atlantic has an article on Kamala Harris. It's called the Kamala Harris Problem. Now imagine in October of 2023, the Atlantic, which is a major magazine, of course,
Hmm.
and it used to be one of my favorites before it had this strident turn to the left. But the Atlantic, and this is what the byline says: few people seem to think she's ready to be president. Why? And they go into this in this article about all the things that are problems with it's like the things she says. She says in one of her interviews, "I just love circles."
Oh, oh boy.
And it's like, she points to
Where
the
do they
banquet
find
seating
these
hall. It's
people?
the curve. I just love circles. I just love school buses. Harris is
I love
and
colors.
yeah, I mean, she says really dumb things that don't mean anything. You know,
Yeah, I
it,
mean,
yeah, it's
yeah,
really funny. And and the thing is that these stories, and of course, I watched her as a senator, and I saw she had this. It's the empowered woman syndrome thing where she you have to be really good supposedly if you're a woman and you're in those positions, but she doesn't seem to have any acumen or talent or sharpness about her. It is all prepared notes. When she was in the Senate during these hearings um, for example, Kavanaugh hearings, she really tried to showboat in her. She was on the Judiciary Committee, the Senate Judiciary Committee, for approving Kavanaugh, and she made these critical stances. But you'd listen to her and you'd go, just empty rhetoric,
there's nothing
just
there.
not. No, there's no there with her. It's like we had a TV show in this country called Veep
Mm,
about a kind of vacuous vice president, female vice president. And it's almost like, sorry, but reality is imitating art here.
Yeah, but I mean,
Um,
a guy like Biden, I mean, sometimes people out there, I think, find him hard to read. What kind of a guy is he? Where does he stand? Because it seems so contradictory. And I see that when it comes to politicians in America, I see these two separate dynamics, which are really dangerous. One, obviously, is the dynamic of communists trying to infiltrate the capitalists, and they're trying to have their assets because at the end they want to take everything over. So this is why sometimes you see leftist politicians, these leftists appearing like they are pro big business and they work with big business and they want the centralization of business power because they think once they take it over, once they're ready to have this revolution, they have all these different huge entities under their control. They don't have to, manage thousands of corporations, but it's fewer, bigger ones. So this is like one dynamic. This is how sometimes people get confused why leftists are sometimes or seem sometimes really pro big business. And the other
well, the
dynamic,
Democrats are just as supported by big business in the United
yeah,
States as
yeah.
Republicans.
And
That's
this
what
is,
people don't understand.
yeah,
And
it's,
there's Democratic, millionaires and billionaires. It's just not the case. Look, the capitalism for a long time has known that there is a left, and they would like to buy into them or buy them off or make sure they're not on their back. And Hillary Clinton, if you go back, and this was so blatant, it was in the New York Times. I read it was a front page article back in January of 2008 when the 2008 presidential campaign was underway. And Hillary Clinton was a leading candidate then. Barack Obama had quite a slog to catch up with her and surpass her. But she went to this fundraiser in New York. I think it was New York, and all these billionaires were there, including Hollywood people, New York people, Wall Street people. And she basically said to them, "Get on the wagon now and pay up now, or be punished later." I mean, she basically was twisting their arm, saying,
hmm,
"I'm going to screw you when I get into
hmm,
office if you don't help me get elected." In other words, it's going to be a sweetheart deal if you help me now and I'm president. I'll make sure
yeah,
your company doesn't get hurt by whatever happens. Because remember, the federal government of the United States now, technically, the Congress passes laws. But in the 1930s, when the Great Depression happened, they created all these new agencies, and they created something called administrative law with administrative law judges, in which the bureaucracies create regulations. They create
hmm.
regulations on the authority of the president, on the authority laws passed, a lot of them in the 1930s,
Is this
which
like
give these
this? Is it
agencies.
so? This is not the same as executive orders. This is just a whole new infrastructure.
Executive orders can be connected to it.
Okay.
Executive orders could be used, could be given to justify agencies writing regulations, right? And so, like when Trump came in, Trump, one of the things he did is he ordered all these regulations repealed from all these agencies. And the thing is that there's a process where people who are affected by these rules can go, and it's not a regular court. It's not a jury. See, originally in America, you cannot be deprived of your liberty or your property or your money without having a jury trial.
Hmm,
That was in the Constitution. And this is the problem, is that it's not really constitutional. I mean, look at the family
hmm,
law
hmm.
courts. It's the same thing. You don't have divorces and family law adjudicated by juries anymore, because you have no fault divorce, and it's now all under these administrative regulations. So you do have judges that do these things, and you do have juries at times, but a lot of it is administrative, and you have specialized administrative law judges and family courts and stuff that do things that, according to the way the Constitution was set up, originally wouldn't be allowed. But now, but so and this was an important decision in the Supreme Court this week on this, by the way, which basically said it restricted these agencies' abilities to write legislation,
Hmm.
which
Interesting.
is it's a huge decision. They called it the Chevron decision. There had been this ruling about Chevron, I assume the oil company, which had given these wide ranging um,
Hmm.
uh, abilities to regulate. And now they're saying, oh, no, you can't do that. So it's like right now, I mean, I don't know, but it almost did at one stroke what something similar to what Trump did when he entered office, saying that, wait a minute, all these regulations aren't legal.
Yeah. Oh,
And
interesting.
and of course, this is quite a, I don't know what the tangle is. I mean, they're trying to probably work it out now. They'll be working it out for the next year. But this is what people don't understand about the how the system works. And this is the problem. It's so complicated. You know, the books of regulation for one agency, they had a I when I was a government contractor in California for the California government, we had a shelf, and on it was a complete shelf about 4 feet long.
Oh
I think it
no.
was 4 foot long
Yeah.
shelf, completely filled with the books that have the rules and regulations in them.
Oh no.
Yeah, for just one
Yeah, and
part of
I
one agency, one part of an agency,
and there's
one
this
one branch.
and there's this other dynamic that I saw many, many times, and this is when multimillionaires and sometimes billionaires, corporations, sometimes they will toss some money towards the left. They hand out money to the left, hoping this is a way to control the left. So it doesn't become a big problem, but that's a very, very dangerous strategy because I saw that a bunch of times when some leftist operative took on such a role. You know, he had this connection to the corporation or whatever, or the rich person, and this leftist operative would say, "Yeah, I'm totally your guy. I'm just corrupt. I'm just here to get my paycheck. I get it. We're just gonna, toss a few crumbs, toss a bone to the left to keep them entertained. I'm all for it. I just love the money." But then these operatives, they're really more connected. They're really more clever, and then they suck out the money, and it's not the way these rich people uh, think it's gonna work out. I mean, would you agree to that? That this is sort of like this dual dynamic. It's communists trying to take over capitalism, trying to centralize business
Hmm.
sometimes to take it over later, and then you got sort of the other way around, in the other direction,
Well,
rich
yeah,
people funding the
it's a
left.
complicated game. You know, there was back in the early '80s, there was this attempt by the left to use pension fund capitalism, and they would use pressure from unions and pressure from regulations and government to attempt to get control of the retirement funds of all the workers in all these major corporations and in government and in schools and stuff, and to be able to invest that money where they want. Of course, what we find out years later is a lot of this money, like the pension fund of the California state workers, kind of vested in China,
Oops.
right?
Oh.
So it's like, you did what with our money? I thought, oh my gosh, these people, since we're headed for war with China, these people aren't going to have they're not going to have pensions,
Right, right.
right? They're not going to have pensions. And it's not just California. There's other states, there's universities, there's teachers unions. They've invested in China, and I don't know the full range of it, but it was pretty significant. And of course, with private corporations getting control of the union, a lot of times your pension is through your union. Your union is part of it. And if you're not union, or the union doesn't thinks you violated the rules, I've known cases where people don't get their pension.
Oh
Maybe
my
worked
god.
for
I
a
mean,
place for 30 years.
I,
They didn't do what they were asked in some strike or something, and that's it.
and a guy like Biden, I mean, he could be all throughout his career, he could be marketed as a sort of in the middle guy, right? So he can pretend
Yeah.
to be for the little guy, but he was also for the credit card companies, and he was for the DuPont company, which is
He
very
had to get
powerful in
elected. He
Delaware.
was a he was a obvious stooge of the KGB and the communists and the Russians, because it was Arm& Hammer who backed him getting elected, and the Council for a Livable
Oh
World, which is a
no.
communist front organization. Yeah, Arm& Hammer put him in the same way that Arm& Hammer. got buddied up with Al Gore Sr. Al Gore Jr.'s, the former vice president under Clinton. His father was a congressman who buddied up with Armand Hammer. Armand Hammer, of course, if you read the Hammer file by Edward J. Epstein, he shows documents from German and French intelligence and so on that showing that this guy was identified as an agent of Soviet intelligence back in the 1920s
Yeah, but I guess
and
those.
30s.
But I bet you those funny Brits, like Lord Louis Mountbatten, they probably told the Americans, "Don't worry, we got our own sources in Russia. This could work out. We got this under control. Don't worry, Americans. We're really good at intelligence. We got this figured out, and we know how that usually ends."
Well, the interwar French and German intelligence, they saw his initial front companies. So this was like the dress rehearsal before he came to New York. And I think a lot ago, he didn't really make it a secret that he was a friend of Lenin's, that Lenin had helped to set him up in business, that he'd had what did he have, a pencil factory in the Soviet Union? And Arm& Hammer really got rich on selling things from the Soviet Union, concessions of various kinds, in the United States. And then he married into a woman, I think it was the Occidental Petroleum fortune. He married into it, if I'm remembering correctly. And so this guy, they had limited funds, of course. Businessmen have to use most of their money for business, and their discretionary spending is limited. So they picked two small states, Delaware
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
Tennessee, to elect senators in these small states. And of course, Al Gore Sr. and Jr., they would posture to be center right on social policy, right? On Biden was a law and order Democrat. He was for prosperity and against crime, and he wasn't none of these liberal positions you see him or left wing positions did you see him taking before, but he was very much the pro Soviet, pro peace, pro environmental kind
Hmm.
of guy,
Hmm.
helping on these strategic issues, helping the Russians, the Soviet Union, and then leading delegations to the Soviet Union, in which we have, the Bukovsky file, in which he is telling a secretary of the not the Politburo, a secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party Soviet Union, look, I have to speak out against you. I have to take a hard line on you, but that's just for public consumption. I'm really your friend,
Yeah. I mean,
right?
you really, really, really don't want Soviet spies in a place like Delaware, where all these corporations are registered. I mean, even Trump has corporations there. Hillary Clinton had corporations there, and it's like this is such a central hub for the economy. If you have spies running around, they could potentially find out all kinds of things. And it's like when I look at Trump, I with Trump, I see sort of this old school business guy, with who's used to these old school rules. You work a lot, you work hard, you play hard, and you have all these corporations, and this becomes overwhelming. And I think we saw that when it came to these indictments and court proceedings. It's just a lot, right? When you're a business guy and your family is in business and you have all these different entities set up, it's really difficult to keep track of everything. And then when there's a hush money payment, and you just want this problem to be gone, and you tell your people to fix it, and then it creates more problems. It's hard to do. And when you have a career politician, that career politician like Biden and Hillary and others, these career politicians, they have to worry about re-election. They have to be focused on kissing babies and being
And
photographed.
congressmen, it's worse. Senators only need to be elected every 6 years, but
Oh no,
congressmen under
yeah,
our
and this is like,
Constitution are
yeah,
elected every 2 years.
yeah, and I mean, I looked at the business history of Trump, and I understand it, and I can compare it, and I can make an assessment of it. But it's isn't it unfair, really, if you have a business guy running, and he's had all this complicated life, he had all this complicated stuff to do, and so that business guy is more vulnerable, and then you have a career politician who's just worried about his re-elections, right? I mean, it's like somehow this is not fair, and
Well, and of course, a lot of these politicians look how a story of how it works. I have a friend who ran for Congress twice, and this is his experience. He runs for Congress twice. The second time, he wins the most votes in the primaries against several. I guess there were several Republicans in this primary, and of course, so he didn't have a majority; he had a plurality, right? He had the most votes of any one person, but it came down to choosing. And the people that were funding different campaigns, they managed the whole state convention in a way that he didn't get picked. One of the weaker candidates, he was the strongest candidate. He didn't get picked. This weaker candidate got picked. Well, what was the character of this guy that got picked? He was he was kind of corrupt. He was not that smart. He was easy to manipulate and control. So it turned out that the money people in the party wanted somebody who was going to do whatever they said,
Hmm.
and that it would do whatever the lobbyists or the people feeding money into the party said. And whereas my friend was independent, he had a lot of important issues, especially national security, he wanted to address in the Congress. And but that was never that rubbed people the wrong way. And why did it? Because he wanted to talk about China being an enemy, about Russia being an enemy, and how we need to decouple from China. Well, how many major companies, how many business interests would be really upset with a candidate who wanted to do something about China,
Yeah.
right? And of course, this was a problem that Trump had in getting elected in 2016. He did not have near the amount of money that Hillary had, because all these companies invested in China were going, "You're going to mess up our deal."
Yeah. Yeah.
Here Obama had negotiated this new set of agreements, and Trump was going to, and he did discard those agreements. And of course, it actually it's odd because it's against the interest of major companies to invest in China, because China is going to end up by ripping them off,
Hmm.
stealing
Yeah.
their intellectual property, and also
Uh,
outright nationalizing them when the day arrives. And China's been preparing that for 2 years now, more than 2 years, against them. But yet they see the money, they get greedy, and then they look at the politicians and they don't want anybody to raise these issues, these national security issues. And I was told that point blank more than 20 years ago by a billionaire's political advisor. Oh no, we're not going to support your book or your message because we know the industrial and financial elite of this country, they want to invest in China and Russia. That was 25 years ago.
oh boy.
So we're not going to support your message.
Yeah.
That's just writing a book and
Do
getting
you
support.
remember? Do you remember that moment from the old debate between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton when Hillary said something along the lines of, "You didn't pay many taxes, you used all these tax write offs." And Trump responded by saying, "Yeah, of course I use these tax write offs. It's the same tax write offs and techniques that your donors use. And I know your donors, or many of your donors, these business people, and they're also smart. They want to keep the amount of taxes low." I think that was an important moment in that debate. And if you think along those lines, you have to understand how different it can be when somebody gives money to a candidate. It can mean all sorts of things. So, for example, obvious example, I think this is the easiest one, and we talked about this in previous episodes. When let's say like Goldman Sachs gives money to a candidate. And then, of course, the truthers, the conspiracy activists say, "Oh my God, these are the globalists. This is the world conspiracy. They give money to this candidate." And another example is this. This was a recent headline. Timothy Mellon from the famous Dynasty. Mellon gave $50 million to a super PAC to support Donald Trump, and this money is going to be used to pay for television advertising. So this is like a typical example in that phase of a campaign, and this can mean different things, right? I mean, if for example, Joe Biden, if he was close to the Dupont family, that became problematic in some ways. But now you have this Mellon guy, and I saw this thing with Mellon. Mellon also gave money to Kennedy, who's also running. and who may or may not be able to prevent a majority for either Trump or Biden. So this is also interesting. So what does that mean? And you have to look at these individuals, and you really have to understand what it could mean. And I also saw, I think it was Abby Rockefeller giving money to Kennedy. And Abby Rockefeller was always known as a communist. So she may be an actual communist. She may pretend to be a communist. I talked about these two dynamics. But, you have to look at each and individual case and try to make sense of it. What does it mean? Because Timothy Mellon, maybe he's just pro-business. He's just conservative. So he gives money to Trump. That's what he can do. But do on the top of your head, do you remember anything nefarious with the melons? Was there anything
No, I
similar to
mean,
the hammer thing, the Occidental thing?
no, I don't. But there's so many politicians. There's over 400 members of Congress, senators and congressmen, and it's hard to keep track. 435 of them, and it's hard to keep track of all their careers and all the ways. I mean, Trevor Loudon wrote a book about the far left ones, but I don't think he went into. He mentioned maybe some of the front organizations, sort of communist front organizations that support them, but and maybe some of the companies. I'd have to go back and look and remember. But Arm and Hammer was a big one. Of course, all of the companies. There were many, many companies that um, Robert Maxwell from England set up in the United States that are probably doing various things. And of course, then there's the PACs. See, the campaign finance reform in the country meant that things were going to be managed by political action committees, PACs. And that big corporate donations, they sort of didn't like that, had a bad look. And of course, it's been controversial because it's a freedom of speech issue. If you're a person or you're a corporation, which is kind of a person, you have the right to give to who you want, to
Mm.
express the views you want, right? And so you have this system of lobbying and system of supporting candidates in elections that's very old in this country. And it goes back, it really started to get to be kind of corrupt after the American Civil War. I think people had a
Yeah,
kind
especially
of,
the 1870s. We did an episode on
yeah,
that. The Captains of
yeah,
Industry, I think it was called.
yeah. It was because I think there was people were a little circumspect in thinking, oh, that's not right. They had more scruples, and then after the Civil War, and it was also the Southern the effect of having a Southern aristocracy, which also influenced the North, and Northerners wanted to see more aristocratic. It in some ways, this is like we set a higher standard for ourselves, and it got to the point where Mark Twain, who was a famous, writer, American writer in the 1870s, 80s, 90s, who wrote that, he described Congress as America's native criminal class and said that no man's purse is safe while Congress is in session.
Yeah,
And
but
and
we
so
talked
this
about
was, yeah,
kind of this two-edged sword that we saw in the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s, and then of course going into the next century, where yeah, it was a serious centralization of economic power, but that also created that new level of economic power, the steel industry, the
well,
oil. And this was
yeah,
the reason why America was finally able to intervene in World War One, and then of course intervene in World War Two, when America, I think, outproduced
yeah.
all the other warring countries combined.
You got to remember there's been this conflict in the United States since the Constitution, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. And the Federalists, Alexander Hamilton being one of the leaders, he wanted a bank, an American National Bank, and he realized what the British had done. He wanted to copy what the British had done, make America this industrial power, make America a great financial power. And he saw tariffs as an important thing. He saw national bank as important. He understood a lot of these sophisticated British instruments that had made the British Empire powerful, and he wanted that. He wanted America to be powerful.
Hmm.
He had this vision of a strong America, and of course, the Anti-Federalists, they just thought of a nation of farmers, and I think you could say that Jefferson was in this camp, thinking that cities were bad and money, the money changers were bad, and that commerce wasn't as good as its farming was clean. And of course, the South, the South was agricultural. It didn't develop industrially the way the North did, and it relied on exporting cotton, and it used slavery. It was black African chattel slavery. And of course, this is the way the country evolved to the Civil War. The North became industrial. The South became, cotton is king, the big cotton producer. The Civil War destroyed all that. And then suddenly you had under Reconstruction, carpetbaggers coming down and getting elected and setting up businesses in the South and using the new dispensation to enrich themselves. And of course, this was greatly resented in the South. And of course, in the 1876 election was basically hung up. I think it was the state of Florida, electoral votes. And they made a deal, end Reconstruction, and you're the president. So
Right.
Rutherford B. Hayes could become president of the United States after Ulysses S. Grant. His term ended because of a backroom deal, right? And that ended Reconstruction. And of course, that's when the Jim Crow began and the blacks started losing their rights again in the South, which General Grant and the occupation of the South had guaranteed the rights of the former slaves. So this was part of the history of the United States. So what ended up happening was during this period, these robber barons, it was about railroad communications and shipping,
Oh yeah.
and it was about the development of these new industries like the steel industry and coal and oil, which was developed. This is what the Rockefellers developed oil as a new product, and of course they had a free market, except that we did use tariffs, which meant that nobody from abroad could undercut them.
Yeah.
And they had this huge country from the Pacific to the Atlantic, from Mexico to Canada. They had this huge market, and of course the problem was they could buy senators, they could buy congressmen, but also congressmen and senators, if they got together, could go against them. And you had this growing resentment from people on the left who thought big business was bad, and then the farmers were getting screwed by the gold standard. This is where
Mm.
you have William Jennings Bryan. I think it was in the election campaign of, I'm thinking it's 1892. Maybe it was 1896. He gave his cross of gold speech. The farmer, the poor rural Americans being crucified on a cross of gold.
Yeah.
You've probably
I
heard
mean,
of that speech. Well, it's so funny. These same people, they want a gold standard now.
yeah,
These
but
same
this is the
people want a
thing.
gold standard.
See, this is the thing. You have guys like Richard Mellon Scaife. This is the extended Mellon Scaife family. They were active in oil, banking, and aluminum. So eventually, they created all these foundations. They wanted to be very conservative and libertarian. So this branched out. Sarah Scaife Foundation supported the think tank Project for an American Century. This was kind of the neocon thing. Then they give money to American Enterprise Institute. They were involved in Newsmax, and I think there's also a connection to the what was it? I think the Heritage Foundation. So they create these foundations, and this is on the
Mm-hmm.
one hand can be a very productive thing. You have professional systems. You create professional politicians who know what they're doing. This is when it works. But if I look at this right now in the situation in America, and you've described this many times, where are the think tanks? Where are the think tanks and the structures who really get it right? When it comes to the Russians, when it comes to really doing a proper professional anti-communism. So I see a lot of frustration in with conservatives, even though these structures exist and these structures have money. So why isn't this working better?
Well, because if you have a philosophy, right, and you have people that believe in it, including businessmen who believe in a certain philosophy, and newspaper men, and they all don't agree. Our society, the United States and a lot of Western Europe, um, it is a tremendously complex. It's not a monolith. People think about big business as a monolith. They think about even government as a monolith, and they really aren't. It's many actors and players who don't see eye to eye, and what you had evolving in the United States through the 20th century is you had, the Democratic and Republican parties didn't differ that much. I mean, William Jennings Bryan, it was
Mm,
his speech was in July of 1896, his Cross of Gold speech. The Democrats represented the South and the large
yeah.
cities in the North. The like New York and Chicago and stuff. So the city bosses and so on. This was the Democratic Party, how it evolved. The Republican Party represented the North, which was much bigger, the farmers in rural and small town North, and some of the larger cities. And it was and a lot of the combine in the late part of the 19th century was out of Ohio. There was a machine there, a political machine that got a number of presidents elected, including William McKinley, for example, who was assassinated after he was elected for this, reelected in 1900. That's how Teddy Roosevelt became president. But the lobbying system, it wasn't it. There's something called log rolling. It's rather complicated, but how it works is that in our Congress, you can create a majority of people who want a bill.
Hmm.
And how do you get them to vote for what you want for your constituents? Like, let's say you want a railroad to go through your part of Nebraska, but you need to get the land in the federal government owns the land or whatever, and you have to, get everything that you need by law to put that railroad through. So you have a bill to come up with what you need to get that railroad to go through. But the problem is, how do you get everybody to vote for it? Well, there's this guy over here who wants to, build a canal,
Mm,
connecting some
yeah.
part of the Great Lakes to his river. So you get together and say, I'll vote for your
The
bill, for your
trading, yeah.
infrastructure project. Right. Log rolling, they call it. That's what they called it.
It's like trading
So
cards. It's like you
like
give you
trading,
this and
and
then
and
give you.
in it, this really got very strong in the 19th century and became a very important part of American. And so lobbyists, part of what lobbyists have done for 150 years or more in the United States is find other lobbyists to team up with to cobble together a majority for both, right? You do this for me, you scratch my back, I scratch yours, and this goes across. And then there's this thing where they put a whole bunch of different things into one bill,
Hmm.
so that certain people won't vote against it because they really want something passed.
Right,
So they're
right.
going to go, well, I don't like all the rest of it, but I like that part of it. And of course, this gives a lot of power in the U.S. Congress
But
the
isn't there a
majority leader.
limitation? Isn't there a limitation how much things you can stuff into a bill? I mean,
Well, it depends on the rules, right? And it's the Speaker of the House and it's the heads of the committees and the Rules Committee, right? There's different committees that say how things are going to be run in the Congress. And the people that run the committees and the Speaker they're the ones that basically make this agenda. That's why political control of the party, whether it's
mm,
Republican or Democrat, is important for legislation. Same thing in the Senate. It just works a little different. And so that in the Senate's smaller, so it's a little cozier. And the senators are in there for longer. And so they're not as much of in a rush, right? It used to be, by the way, in the 19th century, American senators were appointed, they weren't elected. I
right.
forget what year it was in the early 1900s that they changed the law to have senators being elected. But senators were appointed by the state governors and legislatures, I think. I don't remember it's in the original Constitution. I think they were either appointed by the governor and approved by the state senates, or they were elected by the state legislatures, or after being appointed by some process. So I don't remember. It's been a long time since I taught that part of the Constitution, but yeah, it was around early 1900s they changed it because senators weren't supposed to be subject to a direct vote. That was the original idea of the Constitution.
Hmm.
Senators were supposed to be guys. that were chosen by other smart politicians,
Yeah.
right? So they were part of the a political wise guys, you could say.
Sometimes I see, or I can sense, or I can, reconstruct that, decisions are made, strategic decisions with these, rich circles, and the foundations and everything. So they have a plan, they try something, it kind of works. So they try to repeat it, but it can sort of take on a life of its own. And this is something that I noticed over the years a lot. And so, for example, it's like the Republican Party, the Republicans, anytime, every time there's a major election coming, it seems like the Republicans need the truthers, conspiracy activists. They need them for votes. So you see kind of an amplification of the truther movement, but then inevitably these truthers, they go overboard, they go crazy, it spirals out of control, and this is then when the Republicans, they have to put on the brakes, and then the
Mm-hmm.
cycle repeats itself again and again. And for example, back in the old days, it happened with the John Birch Society. They sold millions of copies of books, these best-selling conspiracy books, and this created votes, fine and dandy. But then the JBS, the Birchers, they spiraled out of control. They started to accuse Eisenhower, and then the GOP treated them sort of like dirty children. They're gone too far. They're weird.
Well,
We don't want them
that
anymore.
was really William F. Buckley did that, and it was when we get to the 1964 election where Barry Goldwater is running after Kennedy was assassinated against Lyndon Johnson, and Barry Goldwater had a great message. He had a very strong speaking voice. It was very inspiring, but the Birchers and Robert Welch, they were pretty crazy, and and um, and so Buckley was trying to, he had somehow, as the editor of National Review magazine, sort of be made himself into the arbiter of what is a respectable conservative.
Hmm.
And he took them on. He went after them, especially after Welch gave this speech. I think it was called More Stately Mansions, in which he came out with the completely bonkers Illuminati conspiracy theory, the Masonic part of the Jewish
Mm-hmm.
Masonic conspiracy theory. And that was like, oh my gosh, as soon as you see it's a Masonic part of the Jewish Masonic conspiracy, you're realizing that there's this hidden part of the JBS leadership that maybe they believe the Jewish part of the Jewish Masonic. And of course, that's where we get Revlo Oliver wrote his memoir. I think it came out in the 66 or 67, in which he said, yeah, Robert Welch is an anti-Semite just like me. He was just hiding it. And that's why he called him the Welcher. He was supposed to come out and be honest about it at some point, but he never
Yeah.
did. Because he'd alienate a lot of the people that he'd alienate his followers. So Robert Welch thought he could kind of like gingerly step around where the conspiracy theory he believed in actually came from and what it was really saying deep down.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where a lot of people just don't understand the intellectual pedigree here of that. But yeah, the complexities of the party politics after the war. Um, One of the things, to just go through the history of America, you had this Republican, except for Grover Cleveland, who won two non-consecutive terms, and was a pretty brilliant politician. He was a Democrat. He was the only Democrat to be elected president after the Civil War until Woodrow Wilson, who got elected in 1912 in the 1912 election. So from 1865, well, from 1860 all the way to 1812, you only had one Democrat get elected president.
Hmm. Yeah, I
And
remember
that's a
it.
period of 47 years. That's almost
Yeah,
half a century with
yeah,
only one Democratic president.
I remember that.
And
Yeah.
and so it's important to realize what a colossus the GOP, the Grand Old Party, the Republican Party was after the Civil War, because the Republican Party really formed because of the slavery crisis. It formed in the 1850s, and it basically got a majority of the people in the non-slave states to think, we've got a problem here. How do we, because this, you had bloody Kansas, you had this problem with, does the South get to have territories, and slavery spread throughout the western
Mm.
states? And Lincoln came up with the arguments to say no. Let's preserve slavery where it is. We don't want to upset the South, but we're not going to let it to spread. Well, what they weren't realizing was the South was keeping track of how many Senate seats they needed to continue to dominate the country as they
Yeah.
had. Because if you go before the Civil War, most of the presidents are Democrats.
Yeah, I remember that, especially in the South. It was the Democrats who established this romanticized image of the cowboy for political reasons, even though the real life job of a cowboy, cattle herder, rancher, it was a super hard job. It was super tough, and it's not like the romanticized versions from novels and pamphlets and that sort of thing. And so it's like perception management is I think is the issue here. So I mean, when you try to get people to vote a certain way, and you see some of these strategies, and sometimes they work and they get repeated. I mean, when ultimately the John Birch Society lost its significance, but then came 2015, 2016. Now, the Republicans, they need voters, and many conspiracy activists, these truther guys, they hated the party because of Bush and the war on terror, and they believed that Bush did 9/11 and the elders of Zion did 9/11. The Republicans were, as they said, a tool of the globalists. So, but then, after, this is when we had 8 years, 8 years of Obama. People are sick of that. So then you saw a new surge of this conspiracy activism. And this was the Q stuff, this was other stuff, these were some other people spreading unrealistic expectations of a Trump presidency. The
Yeah.
glorious announcement, he's going to arrest the Democrats next month and stuff like that. So these activists, they bring in new voters. Trump gets into the White House, and then of course these activists, they get sort of placated throughout the 4 years, and then the activists and influencers are needed again in 2020, but it spirals out of control. January 6th, some bits of lunacy. You have to put on the brakes, and at some point, these senior Republicans, especially the military guys, the intelligence guys who know their stuff, these Republicans, they had enough. They say we need to put on the brakes. But then 2022 happens, Russia invades Ukraine, and typically a sitting president can get a lot more popularity when a war happens. And so
Let's talk for a minute about the origins of the disintegration of the Republican Party, which I think in a way it's being transformed, and you could say it's disintegrating. It's becoming something else. If you go back to Republican origins of the Republican Party, as I mentioned, out of the pre-Civil War period, and its dominance between the Civil War and World War One. What happened? How Woodrow Wilson got in as a fluke. It's Teddy Roosevelt became president when he was the vice president of William McKinley. He was a Rough Rider who became famous in the Spanish-American War. He got to be vice president in McKinley's second term. McKinley gets shot, and there we have Teddy Roosevelt being president. And Teddy Roosevelt got one, he finished up McKinley's term. He ran one term and then he quit, and he handed over the mantle to his successor, Taft, who became
mm,
president. And Roosevelt was very unhappy with Taft. And Taft wanted to run for a second term, and basically Teddy Roosevelt wanted to take it away from him. Teddy Roosevelt wanted to go back in the White House again. And they had this disagreement, which split the Republican Party. Teddy Roosevelt formed the Bull Moose Party.
The
And
bull
of
moose.
course, the Bull Moose Party. And it sounds funny, doesn't it? Teddy got shot in Milwaukee while he was giving a speech. He got shot in the chest, and he finished the speech before
Wow.
getting physicians.
Okay.
But he survived the assassination attempt, but he lost the election because the Republican Party split the vote between two guys, and Wilson got in.
Mm-hmm.
Wilson, by the way, was a Southerner. I think he was born in South Carolina, if I'm remembering right. And is the first Southerner to be president after the Civil War, and the second Democrat. And of course, he had kept America out of the war, and he ran for reelection on that basis and won. But he didn't keep us out of the war. And of course, people will talk about that forever. But what happened is that the war, people weren't that happy with the war or the way the Wilson administration ran the war. There was some unfairness and there was restrictions on freedom during that war, freedom of speech. There were prosecutions of people. So what you had is you had Warren G. Harding. So you're going to have a bunch of Republican presidents again. You would have Republican presidents then because, again, the dynamic was the South voted Democrat,
Yeah.
and some of the larger cities where the Democratic machines existed, but the majority of the country, where most people were born on farms, after all, in 1900, majority of Americans, they were going to vote Republican, and they were very solidly Republican. So you have Warren G. Harding, who dies in office. Calvin Coolidge, he wins election. He's a Republican. Hoover, three Republican presidents back to back again. But then you had the Great Depression. And the Great Depression, they blamed it very adeptly on Hoover. And so that caused FDR, who ran as a conservative, by the way, as a fiscal conservative, believe it or not, becomes
Yeah.
president. He's very charismatic. He's very good with the radio. He has his fireside chats. He's very good at communicating to the people. And even though he's a complete rat, his own party ends up not liking him, right? Because why? Because if you read the history of his administration, by the time he runs for a third term, a lot of the most powerful people in the Democratic Party saw that he's a liar. He breaks his promises. They didn't like that. But he was so popular within the country that nobody could unseat him, nobody could go against him. So he wins in 1936, a third term, unprecedented. Nobody had ever. Washington
Mm.
set the standard, two terms and that's it. Now that wasn't written into law. That later gets written into law. It becomes an amendment to the Constitution. We don't want anybody to become a king, right? And keep running. And that's the kind of demagogue that FDR was. And FDR had cobbled together these, and in the meanwhile, the cities, the northern cities in the South, solid South, Democratic South, were part of this coalition that he brought together. Well, after the war, there were people within the Democratic Party said that this treatment of blacks, this Jim Crow, isn't really fair, isn't right. So you had the liberal wing of the Democratic Party pushing for getting rid of Jim Crow, and you had the Republican Party. So you're watching the sort of destruction of the Democratic Party until you get to 1968, right? You get Eisenhower after the war. Truman miraculously gets reelected against the odds in 1948, but he's over, and then the Republicans, they got 8 solid years with Eisenhower. Probably Nixon. I mean, that election in 1960 was just razor sharp. But
Yeah.
remember, the cities are getting more people. Cities are
Yeah.
growing, less people living on farms, less rural small town America. So the Democratic Party is becoming the majority party, where the Republican Party always was. So you get Johnson following Kennedy, and then you get 1968. What happens in 1968 is, because of all the civil rights legislation like Johnson had passed, Hubert Humphrey was Johnson's vice president. He's running for president against Nixon, two vice presidents running for the office in 68. George Wallace, a governor of Alabama, runs for president, and it's a three-way race in 68. The
Hmm.
South isn't supporting the Democratic Party anymore because the South feels the Democratic Party stabbed them in the back.
Yeah.
So Roosevelt's coalition and the coalition that elected Grover Cleveland, which was the South combined with the cities, is no longer viable. The South is angry with the Democratic Party. Basically, we don't know what the election would have been like, but the South went with Wallace, won all the electoral votes of the southern states.
Yeah. I mean, so the Democrats, they gradually became a socialist party, right? I mean, initially, this was not even the political debate, left versus right, socialism
Right.
against republic.
Well, after 1968, what happened is George McGovern headed a committee to rewrite the rules for the primary process to make it more populist, but also he wrote it because the activists in the Democratic Party were the really solid activists in the 60s were on the left.
Hmm.
And by rewriting the rules, they, for example, there were delegates were more important. There were delegates that added to the vote to the delegates that each state would elect. You would have an election, and it's like a bunch of delegates that are committed to a candidate would go to the convention. Well, it used to be that they were larded with state officials, state office holders who could vote for who they wanted, which gave the actual party machine more power to decide who was going to be the presidential
Yeah.
candidate.
So,
And they didn't want that. And so the McGovern Commission changed that. And guess who gets to be their next candidate? George McGovern.
hmm, hmm. Now,
He's the Democratic candidate in 72. And that's when the Democratic Party turns further to the left, is becoming a left wing party.
so basically, some Democrats, they probably thought maybe we can establish some kind of American brand socialism, maybe, right? And others, and
Yeah.
of course, gradually this became a mess. It became a massive problem when you had more and more Russian influence or Soviet influence, because of course, if you have an ideological match, gradually it wasn't so much an American brand socialism anymore. It was sort of this worldwide, more Eastern brand socialism. So this is kind of a way to get into
Not
America.
not really. Remember, even back then, the Democratic Party was the party of the big unions, which were not communist controlled then. The AFL-CIO. I mean, they were left, but they were anti-communist left.
Right.
Okay, and so you have this constituency, but in 1972, even George McGovern was too far left for their taste. So you had Nixon won an unprecedented landslide in 72, but he went down in Watergate, and the propaganda generated by Watergate
Hmm.
was so huge that in 1974, Nixon resigns in October of 74. You have the November 1974 midterm elections, and the Republicans, the conservatives, were demoralized. I guess they just didn't show up to vote, and you elected this incredibly liberal left wing U.S. Congress that basically gave up Vietnam. They
Yeah.
unfunded the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, which collapsed then in 75. By the end of April 75, they were collapsing. And so this was the thing. And of course, the big question was what was going to happen next. And of course, because of Watergate and Vietnam, the Republicans weren't very popular. So you have Gerald Ford, an appointed president, who,
Hmm.
because Spiro T. Agnew, Nixon's vice president, who was from Delaware, from Biden state, was found to be corrupt. He was taking kickbacks from contractors, I think, if I remember right. And so he had to resign. So you had the vice president resign. The first time they used this amendment to the Constitution where you could actually appoint a vice president. They never had this procedure before. So Gerald Ford from Michigan, congressman, the leading Republican of the House, I think you could say. I think he was minority leader, if I'm remembering right. Maybe he was the whip, but he becomes president. Not elected. He tries to run for re-election in 76. Jimmy Carter beats him by a fairly narrow margin. So you have this liberal Carter administration, and it's the Kennedy administration minus the charm plus the extra
Hmm.
added leftist, ideas, right? And so it's a failure. he basically he pushes. He loses Nicaragua, goes the Sandinistas go and take over Nicaragua. He loses the Shah of Iran. So you got a war in Central America. You've got this loss of an embarrassment of this. And of course, Ronald Reagan talking about these conservative slash libertarian values, who really enunciates it for the first time, the conservative message, things that
Yeah.
William F. Buckley and National Review and the conservative movement, the intellectual movement that William F. Buckley and the people around him were trying to foster, sort of comes to life with Reagan. And Reagan gets elected, but as you've pointed out, who gets to be the national security advisor? Who gets to be? It
Mm-hmm.
turns out a Kissinger protege becomes Secretary of State. Um, um, you have other traditional Republican forces because Reagan basically had to negotiate with the old line. He took on his vice president George Herbert Walker Bush, who
Mm.
was part of that Republican kind of liberal Republican establishment. He's not really a conservative,
Yeah.
George H.W. Bush, but the Reagan administration, Reagan's leadership in his first term, and he brought in a lot of true believers, and of course he has the South behind him. I think I think that if I remember right, Carter maybe won two states, which would be
Mm.
Georgia and which was his home state because he was governor of Georgia, and Minnesota. His vice president Mondale was from Minnesota. So I think it was only two. Maybe he won three states, but Reagan won this tremendous landslide and then was reelected against Walter Mondale in '84 with a landslide again. And people were saying then, because the South had flipped to the Republicans, that now the Republicans were going to elect the president from here on out. Although on a state by state basis, the majority of senators and congressmen were Democrats throughout
Yeah.
the 80s. The Democrats controlled Congress from around the mid 50s when the Republicans lost the Senate all the way to 1994, and then when you had Clinton getting elected, which was a Southern, ostensibly a moderate Democrat, get elected president. And by the way, it was largely the reason a lot of people don't understand why George H.W. Bush did not get reelected. And here's why. When Bush ran in '88, he said, "Read my lips, no new taxes."
Yeah.
He's doing something from that Clint Eastwood, and
Yeah. Yeah.
Clint Eastwood movie. Read my lips, no new
Mm-hmm.
taxes, and it's and what did he do? He raised taxes.
But wasn't it?
And so he lost a lot. Part of his constituency didn't want to vote for him anymore.
But when I looked at the trutherization that kept happening, the conspiracy movement, they sort of marketed themselves as was the case in the 60s and 70s with the Birchers. These modern truthers, they marketed themselves as like the most pronounced anti-communist. So they tried to claim that, and they were so against various topics. And in the 2000s, the truthers, they were against the climate change stuff and many other things. So you saw the general Republican Party, and they try to play nice with different groups and make sort of compromises. And then you had the truthers, the conspiracy activists, and they were completely uncompromising. They were really harsh on everything, and that's how they got a bigger following. And eventually, George H.W. Bush became sort of the enemy of the truthers, and then George W. Bush
Oh
became the
yeah,
enemies of the
because
truthers.
remember it was George H.W. Bush that said when the Soviet Union collapsed that we have a new world order now. We're going to have a
Yeah,
new
but I
world
mean,
order.
but
And they
how?
turned they turned new world order into a conspiracy meme,
Yeah, but
right?
more and more people who were right wing became these right wingers became extremely anti-Republican. Then, of course, 9/11 happens, and all bets were off. So this was started the new movement with the internet. The Republicans were regarded as the center of evil, the center of the globalist conspiracy. And I remember that at the time during the Bush era, this became such a big theme that some people who were more leaning towards conservative, they were considering voting Democrat because the threat
Well,
seemed so
see,
big.
yeah, there was this, you had two Bush presidencies. You had George Herbert Walker Bush, and then you had George W. Bush presidencies. And okay, they're Yale graduates, they're bonesmen, they're skull and bones, and of course, there's this whole conspiracy literature about skull and bones, about the financial elites being bad, and of course, it's the globalism of the Republican Party, the globalism of John Foster Dulles, is was really just an echo of the internationalism of the era of the late 19th century empires, where people were there was a genuine world of trading and getting rich
Yeah.
together starting to grow out of that until World War One interrupted it, and World War Two again. And they had this vision of a peaceful world of trade and commerce. And this got, by the time you get to Alex Jones and the convolutions of the conspiracy theory, by the time you get to the 21st century, they have woven all of these threads, these very different
Mm,
things, together as one thing, one all-consuming, almighty conspiracy.
yeah. And so this was kind of like when in the 2000s Bush era, when Alex Jones, for example, and there were many others, they were talking about the FEMA internment camps. So the Federal Emergency Management Agency was conspiring against the conservatives and the patriots. They would create this internment camp system, and then somebody would give a signal. The patriots would be disarmed, put in these camps, and America would be handed over to the United Nations or the Elders of Zion or whatever.
Yeah,
And so
they
this
claimed
was
that the United Nations was bringing military vehicles, and that United
yeah,
Nations troops would come in and occupy the country under some
yeah.
pretext. Yeah,
Exactly,
they
and
were
so
claiming that.
so then the focus was on the Republicans. So they were the worst thing in the world, the biggest enemy. That was kind of the sentiment at the time. And now, of course, when Obama got in, this started to shift somewhat, and this is when even Alex Jones became more pro-Republican, and he started to
Well,
talk
remember,
differently.
Timothy McVeigh and the Oklahoma City bombing happened during the Clinton years. So Clinton was counted as a bad guy too. So the Clintons and the Bushes were considered bad. And they didn't differentiate. It was like when you talk to these people in the 90s, and then when George Herbert Walker Bush was, his son becomes president in 2001, you find that they don't really differentiate between the Clintons and the Bushes. They're all the
Yeah.
uniparty, right? And you've probably heard this claim: it's a uniparty. There's no difference between them. And this was part of the message. By the way, that's in communist literature. They say the exact same thing. Communist literature says the Republicans and Democrats are just two sides of the same capitalist system. There's no
Right, right.
difference, you know.
And
So
now
this was typical of radical, rhetoric.
and nowadays you have a situation where the Republicans, they need the truther vote. I think this is why you saw Trump in his first campaign, or the campaign trail when there was an interview on the Alex Jones program. So this was like a new thing to the Alex Jones audience, that a leading candidate for the Republican Party was appearing on the Alex Jones show. And so, again, needing voters, and I still don't have any concrete numbers how many votes Alex Jones was able to provide for the Republican Party. So I don't know exactly what numbers we're
Probably
talking
around
about.
2 million, maybe.
Something like that. So it's a serious number, but this introduced the well-known problem that these truthers then spiral out of control, and this starts to worry the Republican Party. And so now again, the truther vote is kind of needed to a degree, and we also see this in Germany with the extreme right-wing party, the right-wing party, the AfD. They're mobilizing the truthers here, and they're using a lot of the American material, a lot of the American stuff. They just translate it for German audience, and this is how you get people to become active. Because if you get the
Well,
truthers, you get
yeah.
people active. And now in
There's a
Britain,
there's a there's a different there's we haven't mentioned Patrick Buchanan's role in this. Patrick Buchanan is a kind of a odd kind of paleoconservative who kind of believed certain things. He liked the America Firsters of the interwar period of the 1930s. He thought that America shouldn't have gotten involved in World War II and World War One. And Buchanan had his own unique philosophy. Buchanan ran for president in the Republican Party in 1992, challenging George Herbert Walker Bush, and it certainly damaged him because, if I remember correctly, Buchanan won the New Hampshire primary, which was not a good sign because up till that point, nobody had ever won the presidency after losing the New Hampshire primary in modern American primary history. So that was a significant blow. Of course, since then that rule is out the window, but that was a bad sign for Bush's prospects in 92. And then Buchanan ran again in 96 and got edged out by the senator from Kansas. Trying to remember his name. He was a war hero. Threw himself on a grenade in World War II and saved his buddies, but somehow survived. Not remembering his name, but anyway, he lost to Clinton in a re-election, and Buchanan had this following. So that I think when Buchanan ran again, he would take like 1% of the vote. I think it's something like that he would get subsequently, and so I think that was the conspiracy constituency, the America First constituency that you're talking about really was Pat Buchanan's constituency within the Republican Party. It was anti-immigrant. He wanted to stop illegal immigration. He wanted to, have tariffs like Trump has got. He wanted to raise tariffs. So a lot of the features that Trump is made popular were originally what Buchanan was arguing for.
yeah. Now, there's another example that's very, very current. This is in Britain. They have an election coming up. A leftist is going to win, and this leftist guy, he's been to this Starmer guy. He's been to these elite universities, and he's of course close to the aristocracy there. And we talked a lot about how infiltrated the aristocracy is. Russian infiltration there. And so then you get a guy like Nigel Farage. And I remember Farage from even way before the Brexit time, the Brexit days, when Farage would have these speeches in the European Parliament, and he was just attacking these horrible politicians, and that made Farage kind of famous. Now, of course, the truthers, the conspiracy activists, they started to love Nigel Farage. And now it's a situation that Farage wants to be active again in politics, and it seems like he needs the activists, and he's hanging around with these reform guys, and they're total truthers apparently. They love Putin, they love Russia, and they would like him, Farage, they would like him to say it's all the West's fault, Putin is great, the war is great. But of course, this is so insane that Farage can't say this in public, so he chose recently on the BBC, that created headlines, he chose sort of a middle position. So he's saying things like, yeah, of course it's Russia's fault, it's a disgusting, terrible, horrendous, illegal war, but it's also the West's fault. So he's kind of trying to position himself in the middle so he can please these reform people. They're happy, but he doesn't want to go overboard with this. So it's kind of this weird situation to have a politician. who seems like dependent on these activists. If he doesn't please these activists, he's irrelevant in politics. So he's trying to work with them, use them. They want to use him, and it's like this bizarro situation. Just like with these right wingers in Germany, they need the truthers. If they don't mobilize the truthers, there's not much going on for them. I mean,
Well, I should add this other. You see, there's a failure of the Republican Party in policy. The Republican Party's free trade policy and investment in China and Russia. And there was a thing called NAFTA, which not only did Clinton support NAFTA, but the Republicans did too. And this NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, that's what NAFTA was a disaster. And this is where Buchanan was correct about illegal immigration, about free trade. Buchanan was ahead of his time in recognizing these as problems. And of course, but being in his America First position, however, his strategic ideas were mistaken. But his ideas about trade and so on were correct. The problem is there's a problem there in that the trading system we developed during the Cold War was the trading system that held the alliance together, the economic incentive that kept Western Europe and Japan and South Korea, etc., basically eating out of the same dish, so to speak, that we all helped each other economically, according to something that had really been worked out under the Eisenhower administration and then continued to develop on its own. So Buchanan was offending certain economic interests when he was saying this. So it
yeah.
wasn't, nobody was ready to hear it. And they believed, because the Cold War had ended, see, and this is what unleashed this. It was the end of the Cold War that unleashed it. And believe it or not, I was a lobbyist once.
Hmm.
A friend of mine who was a lobbyist for a large business organization in Southern California asked me to lobby Chris Cox, our Republican representative in Orange County, to lobby him to vote against NAFTA.
Mm-hmm.
So I was a lobbyist against NAFTA back
Right.
in 1993, I think it was. And so I actually spent more than an hour on the phone because they give time to lobbyists. You couldn't meet with the guy, but so this lobbyist said, I'm going to lobby and this guy's going to make my argument for me. So I argued with him. And this is so I got to see what this process of lobbying was like. Why was Chris Cox, a Republican, going to vote for Clinton's NAFTA bill, right?
Yeah.
Which was disastrous. And so my argument went like this: America's not a company, it's a country. We need to have a border. We need to be able to
Yeah.
control our own commerce. And and I said it's going to be a disaster because these other countries, it's not really free trade. They're going to devalue their currency. They're going to cheat, and we're going to lose jobs, and it's going to hurt our country. We're going to have a Rust Belt plus.
Yeah.
And so this is what he says to me. Chris Cox says to me, he says, well, Milton Friedman says it's good. And Milton
Ugh.
Friedman is an economist that I believe and I trust. So I have to go with him. And I said, okay, what if this passes and it becomes a disaster? Will you sponsor a bill to repeal NAFTA? And he said, yes, I would. And I
Okay.
said, so if they devalue the peso and there's a crisis on Wall Street, you will? Yes, I will. What happens? It isn't. 3 months later, the Mexicans devalue the
Yeah.
peso. Goldman Sachs is ready to hit the wall. They need to be bailed out. And so I call them up and I say to Chris Cox, I say, okay, you promised me that if this was a fiasco, that we have to bail out Goldman Sachs, that you will sponsor a bill to repeal this. And he said, no, I'm not going to sponsor. So he lied to me. He
Ugh.
said, no, I'm not going to sponsor a bill to repeal this. I'm just not going to vote for the bailout, as if that was even something, it was a done deal,
Yeah.
right?
here's a
That's my
pretty
experience being a
yeah.
lobbyist. That's it.
Okay. Here's a pretty strong example of how Republicans function, how the party functions, what the foreign policy was, and just how people misperceive it, especially the pro-Trump people, activists, not just the truthers, but a lot of them, right? So this is like a group of people. They say they love Trump and they have the greatest expectations of another Trump presidency. They're such diehard Trump supporters, but they don't seem to really understand a lot of very important issues and policies of the previous Trump administration. There's a cross disconnect here. So this was a recent text published by Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg and Fred Fleitz. This is from April. It's called "America First: Russia and Ukraine." So Kellogg was basically Trump's general security expert advisor. He had a senior role in the National Security Council. He was also acting national security advisor for a time. So he was Trump's guy. He's not some globalist, whatever some people may think. He's not just some guy removed from the Trump administration. He was a very important person. And so in this text, he gives a very straight assessment of the war in Ukraine, how the Biden administration was way too weak on foreign policy. They gave all the wrong signals, and then came the invasion, and then there were more serious mistakes or intentional sabotage maybe by the Biden administration. And so then Kellogg makes this distinction between these administrations, and Kellogg also says what a realistic peace deal would look like, how harsh it would be on the Russians, and how to make this work in the coming years and even decades. This would happen in stages, right? And this text is pretty good, I think, and I think that many activists out there, they would be completely surprised when they read that, because activists, they saw on the internet, well, Trump is in some crazy alliance with Putin, and they all work together on everything, and they're going to save us from the globalists. But in reality, the Trump admin had a very harsh, strong foreign policy, pushing back against the Russians on multiple fronts. The missile treaties for the nuclear missiles, pretty harsh against Iran. The Trump admin was also very much against these Nord Stream pipelines, which were ultimately blown up. And this is stuff that people seem to forget, or they were not really aware of it because they sort of live in this internet fantasy world.
And I might add that Trump also was the first president to send weapons to Ukraine.
Yeah, exactly. Lethal aid.
Obama wouldn't do it.
Yeah, lethal aid. And we saw some legislation that was even for the domestic realm during Trump. This was, I think, what was called the Countering Foreign Influence Act or something, or Countering Foreign Propaganda Act. So there were multiple pieces of legislation like this. So this was pretty serious. And so I got some excerpts and quotes from that text. And it starts with an important point here. It says, Putin saw in Trump a strong and decisive president who was prepared to use all tools of American power, peaceful and coercive, to defend U.S. interests. Similar to other U.S. adversaries, Putin also viewed Trump as unpredictable and unconventional. In light of Trump's threat to destroy North Korea if it threatened U.S. allies in the Asia-Pacific, Trump's summits with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, moving the U.S. embassy in Israel to Jerusalem, bombing Syria for using chemical weapons on civilians, dropping America's largest bunker buster bomb on an ISIS redoubt in Afghanistan, imposing strong economic sanctions on China while keeping dialogue open. Putin could not be sure how Trump would respond to Russian belligerence. This unpredictability played an important role during the Trump presidency in impeding hostile actions by U.S. adversaries.
Absolutely.
Fair enough.
The one thing is that Trump is so unexpected and so difficult to fathom because he's so different. I mean, imagine going against the grain. You have Pat Buchanan was just did not succeed pushing this message about the border and about restrictions of trade. The Republican Party had become a free trade party, and the Democrats were willing to go along despite their commitments to labor. And it seemed like nobody could go against this because the elites wanted to invest in China, especially. Well, then Trump, but you see, this was always doomed. This is what people don't realize is that open borders and trading with China was always doomed.
Yeah.
So Trump had the vision thing, right? Thing that George H.W. Bush made fun of in 1992, the vision thing. The fact of the matter is that that was Trump saw the writing on the wall, and he waited. People had talked about him running for president in earlier years. He waited until this time, and of course, part of the constituency that saw Americans see when you're a conspiracy theorist, you see the evil forces destroying America. You don't necessarily understand them. You have a narrative about them. And part of that evil that's destroying America, of course, is free trade and open borders.
Yeah.
And so here comes Trump. So he's going to immediately win this constituency. And along with the, what was it Hillary Clinton called them? She had a name for them.
The
Um,
deplorables?
the deplorables, right? They're the deplorables, right? So they're racist because they don't want an open border. They're the Jim Crow Southerners. But the reality was that secretly a lot of people were beginning to have this thought by the time you get to 2016. Wait a minute, Russia was a bad country. China was a questionable country. We were seeing more of their theft of American property. So what's ironic was that all these things that they resisted tooth and nail against Trump and called him all kinds of bad names, when he got what was it? He got a 10% tariff. I forget. He got a tariff
Mm,
passed on China, and the Biden administration kept it, and big business suddenly was for it. Why? Because they realized that it was suicide, what they were doing before. They were so set on this idea and this model in their head, and all of a sudden they realized, well, Goldman Sachs is is practically been colonized by China. These people, they're not thinking straight, and so you got it to where Biden couldn't repeal it. They kept the trade practices,
yeah.
and also it was the revenue. The huge amount of revenue that we got from this was so big that they couldn't forego it.
And
They
so by
literally couldn't forego the revenue.
and so you saw sort of this duality, I think, of making these moves in foreign policy, being harsh, um being really strong in foreign policy, at the same time making some positive statements, words in public about Putin, and I think that was strategic. I think that was maybe the idea of a guy like Kellogg, because he explains that in the text. You have to be really harsh and strong, but you have to keep open some sort of a dialogue because that can reduce the overall pressure. And people, they started to pick and choose what to make of it. So they were not really looking at the actions, they were looking at the words of Trump. But I think that a lot of these words were strategic. And it says here in the text, in 2018, after the Russian mercenary Wagner Group advanced on U.S. bases in Syria, they were met with immediate and decisive action when President Trump authorized punitive airstrikes against them. Those airstrikes set back Russia's operations and influence in the region. Russia never retaliated against the United States over that attack, which reportedly killed hundreds of Russian mercenaries, likely because Putin did not know how Trump would respond. Now, that's a bold
Well,
move because,
do you know what really happened there? Is that we thought that these were Russian troops,
yeah,
and our commander was told, "Well, go find out if they're Russians." So we called him up and we said, "We understand that these are your troops here."
no, they're
And the Russians
private.
said, And the Russians said, "Oh, we don't have any troops there." "Oh, you're certain those aren't yours?" "Oh, those are not ours." So
Kaboom!
yeah, yep, that's what happened. And so
Oh,
they couldn't
we're
say
just making
anything.
sure.
They
We're just
lied
making
to
sure here.
us.
You know, we're just making sure
Yeah,
here.
we were
Kaboom!
just making sure, and so they because they lied to us, they couldn't come back and say you attacked
You
our troops. We
killed
have
our
to
people.
retaliate
Yeah,
on you.
right,
No,
right.
no, you told us that they weren't yours, right?
Oh
It was
boy.
so perfect, right? It was just perfect.
Yeah.
So they
Because I mean,
couldn't
of course,
say
that was there
anything.
was like the panic. A lot of people had, and they still have this panic that if Americans actually kill Russian troops, that would be like panic mode,
Right.
hyper alert. But these were Wagner people, so it was a bold move. And I don't have all the details about what he says there in the text about these strikes demolishing Wagner operations in the entire region. So there was like a larger concept behind these strikes. You get more room to breathe in that area. And so this kind of got lost in all the media chatter about this, that, and the other. But it's important to make that point, and I don't think many activists really knew about this. Many activists really understood that, because they were being fed this
Mhm.
whole "we're gonna save the world with we're gonna
Yeah,
save
and
the
then
world with
meanwhile,
Putin" thing.
people are saying that Trump is a Russian puppet, which is ridiculous. He was harder on Russia than Obama or Biden has been.
Yeah,
And the thing is that he sort of set the pattern that they could not seem to be softer on Russia than him or get caught out in their lies. And this is a funny thing that happened with Trump. And of course, Trump is very cagey. Trump Trump is very intuitive, and with the Russian thing, look what he did with Little Rocket Man. And of course, South Korea is really a satellite of Russia more than it is of China, and they get their weapons of mass destruction from Russia. I think that anybody in higher up in intelligence who's authorized to tell you anything is going to say that to you. Is that the Chinese give them their conventional weapons as hand-me-downs from the People's Liberation Army, but they're really strong weapons that North Korea has are coming from Russia. The nuclear weapons, the chemical weapons, the biological weapons. I mean, um, defecting North Korean soldiers test positive for smallpox
oops.
because they've been vaccinated by the against the weaponized smallpox form, which is a Russian weapon, not a Chinese weapon.
Oh boy.
So what's so interesting about that is that Little Rocket Man, they have this war of words, Trump and him, and Trump is
The
like
who's got the bigger
ready to
button,
go.
right? Yeah, I got the
Right,
bigger
who has the
button.
bigger button? And it's like, and what happens the first time a North Korean leader is going to meet with an American president to negotiate,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
And of course, what does he do? He goes there, and everybody thinks this is amazing. The president
yeah.
meets with
And we've seen
this
that
guy, and
before.
of course, yeah.
We,
And what was interesting is that Trump went there and didn't agree to anything, and just
yeah,
left. And of
and you
course, there was Little Rocket Man having to execute his diplomats with an anti-aircraft gun because that's when what happens to his failed officials when they fail, they execute him with. I don't know what that looks like. That has got to be grisly, but
Yeah, and you explained that so well in one of the previous episodes of this show when he talked about, I think it was Eisenhower, and he made the situation very clear for the Soviets. If you want to have World War III, we're gonna we're gonna have World War III, and you're gonna lose hard. So this was a time when you had to call, maybe a bluff. Wasn't, of course, not really a full bluff, but sometimes you just gotta call it like it is. And we've seen that before. And in modern days and modern eras, we saw kind of the bureaucratic politician type, especially the Germans. They're all so nice and they're all so diplomatic in their language, but you're really lacking clear statements and bold
well, just
statements.
think about it. That the fact that Eisenhower was ready to go to World War III in 1953 caused the fall of Stalin.
Yeah.
If Stalin's bodyguards are telling us the truth, the last surviving ones in the late 90s that testified. Um, why? Because Stalin was going to didn't have any problem with it. Let's do World War III now. I'm old. I want to do it before I die. And his deputies, Khrushchev and Lavrentiy Beria, thought, oh no, we don't want to die. We're not old
Yeah.
enough yet. We still have some years left. We don't want you to kill us along with everyone else. So that got Stalin overthrown. So you could say that Eisenhower being ready to go to war and being serious about it caused Stalin's fall.
Yeah, and it's like it's
If you
not
think about
all.
it,
It's not just all about Trump. It's not just Trump's words. We have these people. We had these people behind him, guys like General Kellogg and others, and they can give him the options. They can say, "Okay, Mr. President, there's like 5 options here. What kind of a statement you want to give? You already chose the option for the military action against these Wagner people. So now you can choose different types of statements. You want to use a harsh statement, you want to use a less harsh statement. It's not just Trump. People in Europe, they believe that this was all about Trump, and Trump could one day make some silly decision to have World War III. That's not how it works. And this is like the
no.
media distortion that was going on all the time. And here it
Well,
says,
yeah.
and here it says in the text, it says, the Trump administration strengthened Europe's deterrence posture towards Russia by revitalizing the NATO alliance to work for American interests by pushing NATO members to contribute fairly to the alliance and meet their NATO Article 3 in Wales Declaration defense spending targets. That's what Trump meant what the intention was behind Trump's words when he said, well, if they're not going to do their thing and pay for it, why have NATO? Of course they want NATO, and the people behind Trump, of course they wanted NATO, but they had to make a strong statement to make these Europeans get active. And it's like I always tell these Europeans here, stop the whining, stop complaining about American American military bases abroad. Stop whining about American imperialism. Fund your own militaries. Do your own thing. Contribute to that. Because if things go wrong, you want the Americans to help you. So which is it? Whining about American military bases and American military force, or needing it? Which is it, right? So this was kind of a major point, because some of these European countries, they were not even meeting the 2% target, 2%
No,
spending on military.
they had treaty obligations to their defense spending, and they were
Yeah,
not
so,
meeting those obligations
and
year after year.
they would find ways around even the 2% target, let alone a
Sure.
3%, 4% target. They were coming up with all sorts of ridiculous things like, we Germans, we don't have ammo, we don't buy ammo, we don't do this, we don't order new ammunition and weapons. It was a joke. And of course, if there's a military defense alliance, the members have to contribute. It's as simple as that.
Well, let me put it in another way.
But
The
the truth
NATO
is,
countries,
before I forget that, and
yeah,
the conspiracy activists, they think NATO is the devil, and NATO is the tool of the globalists, and I'm for Trump, and
yeah,
that's because
right.
he's against NATO. That's not how it works.
They don't understand that their own economic well-being, their own survival depends on these alliances. They don't understand that this is the structure of the world that preserved their way of life, that preserved their actual economic wherewithal. And I should say here, the NATO European countries have a much greater combined gross national product, if you combine them all together, than the U.S. has. They have more economic wherewithal than the U.S., and yet they contribute
Yeah.
a fraction of what the United States contributes. And of course, the United States is defending, and it is useful because America is behind those two oceans, and America is in a better position to defend Europe than Europe is. But they have to do something, because the Americans can't carry the all of the weight, because we have to defend the Pacific as well. We
Yeah.
have to maintain this enormous Navy, Air Force, and a sizable enough Army and Marine Corps to be able to respond to these multiple threats. And, I have to say, in the Pacific, Japan and South Korea obviously have stepped up. Those societies are doing their share. But Europe,
Yeah.
it's been a sorry thing to see.
Disaster. So,
Yeah.
and then it says this, and this is one of my favorite bits in the whole text. It says, the Trump administration imposed strong sanctions against the Nord Stream 2 pipeline built to transport Russian natural gas from Russia to Germany to halt its completion. Trump officials also pressured European states to delink from the Russian energy supply, an effort that undermined Russia's ability to weaponize energy in the region, and one that Europe resisted until Russia invaded Ukraine. Exactly. And I mean, if some conspiracy activist is reading this, he would say, What? I don't understand. This goes
Well,
against what I heard.
here's the real thing, Alex. The real conspiracy is you have the Green Party and the Social Democrats
Oh, yeah.
and Merkel's party pushing
The
this
commie pipeline.
global warming at the same time they're importing Russian oil,
Oh, it
and they're
gets better.
getting rid of nuclear plants. And so this is a conspiracy to destroy Germany's
Yeah.
energy infrastructure,
And it gets
to
better.
destroy Germany as an industrial power.
Because I kept reporting on this pipeline thing over the years, right? So at some point during the Trump administration, the Republicans they were getting serious. They were becoming serious. They imposed these sanctions, and it was all encompassing. They said if anybody over there in Europe, if anybody has anything to do with that stupid pipeline, you build it, you help building it, you certify it, you insure it, you underwrite it, anything. You got anything to do with this, we will block you from anything. Block you from anything American, block you from things you don't even know about. Strongest possible move you can imagine. So they were saying, this is really serious to us. And guess what the Social Democrats did in Germany? They try to find a way around these American sanctions. They created a foundation, and they said this is a foundation to protect the environment, but this was just a tool to go around these American sanctions. This is really what happened. But people on the internet or listening to Tucker Carlson and all these people, they think, wait a minute, I thought this was a conservative pipeline from the conservative Russian president. This was a conservative pipeline, and only the left-wing world conspiracy wanted to end this pipeline. No, the Trump admin tried to stop it. For real. And it says here, this included Trump publicly criticizing Germany for making itself dependent on Russian gas imports. At a July 2018 NATO summit, Trump condemned Germany's support of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, saying Germany, as far as I'm concerned, is captive to Russia because it's getting so much of its energy from Russia. Exactly. I mean, he's not mincing words. Captive. We are imprisoned by this nonsense, and we got up to, I think, 40%, maybe up to 40% dependency at some point. Maybe a third to 40%.
Yeah,
insane, completely crazy. And like,
I mean, how is Germany going to survive? You let go of your own coal and nuclear industries in
Yes.
order to take this Russian gas. And what did the Russians do the first chance they get? They screwed you.
Yeah,
They screwed Germany.
Yeah, and then people, when this gas crisis hit and the pipelines were blown up, and I'm sure that Kellogg was not crying because the pipelines were blown up. We still don't know who did it. Many people could have done it. It wasn't hard to do. The Russians were so weak in this, just so you know. This when this gas crisis happened, and there was almost a blindside. This was in the media, mainstream media here. I think I mentioned this on the show, and I read the quotes. So there was almost a Russian blindside where they would move out the money from these gas companies and the shares in Germany, so to leave us hanging. So we would be in chaos, and the Russians would then use the chaos with their political assets to create more chaos. And so when we were short of gas, or potentially short of gas, people started saying, hey, wait a minute, according to the leading experts, the geological experts, not the gas companies, not the environmental guys, the actual experts, they said we're sitting on a considerable amount of gas, way more than people realize, but you have to frack to get it. Now, guess who spread a ton of propaganda against fracking. The Russians, they funded some of these movies against fracking and
Oh
saying this
yeah,
is terrible.
they did.
Tell this to a conspiracy activist. Tell this to a MAGA guy who loves Trump and people who think they know how this all works. Tell these people how it works. Ooh boy. Uh
Yeah, no, they see the thing that's happening here now in America is that the Republican Party, which had more of the sensible people, as the Russian infiltration of certain parts of the Republican Party, as the Alex Jones message and other things have sunk into more and more people, you have now got this groundswell where a majority of the members of Congress of the Republican uh, part of the House are not for supporting Ukraine. And it's largely because they do this. They're worried about the voters. And it's because of this transformation of the Republican Party from the Republican Party of the older conservatives. William F. Buckley died in 2008,
yeah.
right? So William F. Buckley and that whole group, and you had Buchanan that had broken off with this message earlier, and then you had the conspiracy movement. You have Alex Jones. You had the social media advancing all these very odd conspiracy theories. This has disintegrated the Republican Party. Then it lost its intellectual anchor. Now I'm a critic of William F. Buckley, but when he denounced the Birch Society, and I think it was 1962 actually that he denounced it, he said that they lacked. He said something like they lack common sense.
Yeah.
They don't have and he said there's a lot of good anti-communists there, but this is really crazy. It's goofy
Yeah.
conspiracy theory stuff. And of course, Buckley was absolutely right on that. He was. And it was a danger. He said you have to purge them from the ranks of the Republican Party. But now they've become the most active of the activists, whereas the hard left, socialists in the Democratic Party can have this inordinate influence on the primary process, and the Democratic Party's been captured by the communists anyway. They took it over through its left wing, if you can believe what the communists were saying in the 1980s. What I overheard them saying, we're taking it over. It looks like with the nomination of Obama and the Clintons and Biden as their candidates. But the Republican Party, now this is a different kind of activist group coming into the Republican Party from the conspiracy right, and with these completely false narratives. As I read last time, the quote from Sergei Witta saying that this is a party with no viable ideas. This is where they're headed if they follow this way. Now, Trump has very viable ideas. He's right about these key issues that he got elected on. The problem is the constituency, the way they're exploiting his
Mm,
constituency, this group that's growing, and the kind of groundswell it's being created for people other than Mr. Trump that are followed, like Mr. Nick Fuentes, people like that,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I
And
mean, these people are the real crazies. These are the really dangerous people.
yeah. Then it says this. During the Trump administration, the United States no longer tolerated Russia's repeated nuclear treaty violations and withdrew from the Open Skies Treaty and the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces (INF) Treaty. The Trump administration also began the process of withdrawing from the New START nuclear arms reduction treaty, with Russia in hopes of negotiating a stronger and more effective treaty that also would include China's nuclear arsenal. There you go. Now, we Europeans, we are in the crosshairs of a lot of Russian missiles. They have all kinds of missiles with different ranges, and they can be fitted with nuclear warheads. Some of these rockets, smaller or medium-sized rockets, they're even stealth rockets, so it's harder to see them on a radar screen and everything. So again, this is an issue that is extremely important, and this goes completely against what a lot of people actually believe out there, people who support Trump, but they don't understand how strong that was in terms of foreign policy, pushing back against the Russians, right?
Yeah, It was so, and so going to the debate here, which was odd, is that Biden was pretending. If you really watch the debate, he was attempting to paint Trump again as a Russian agent, and the way he talked, and unfortunately Trump didn't directly answer him on this. Trump didn't really understand that. Maybe he did understand it and he didn't want to offend that part of his constituency.
Yeah.
But Biden was again framing the issue like Trump is really not going to be helping to defend our security and NATO. He was accusing Trump of being of wanting to destroy NATO. And I don't think that that's really true. It may, I hope it isn't true. But Trump makes these statements. Trump did not, he was president 4 years and he didn't destroy NATO,
Yeah. Yeah, and
right?
he
So why would he
bolstered.
destroy NATO now?
Yeah, and he bolstered NATO, as we just heard, by speaking very strong, clear words about Europe. And it's like some of these super important things, they get lost in all the chatter. People don't really realize them. They focus on something else. The sensation of the day, or the sensation of the
But
week.
Biden, Trump mentioned during the debate how much Biden was lying, and of course, you could
Yeah.
see these lies that Biden was lie after lie, and it was like direct contradiction of Trump on the facts. And what's really interesting is that if Biden was lying about all that, do they trust Biden when he says he really supports Ukraine and he's
Yeah,
opposed to
exactly.
Russia? If he's a
Exactly.
liar about just about everything, why is he telling the truth about that? Why
Yeah.
would they trust him on that?
Activists, yeah, these activists out there, and these influencers, these very problematic influencers, they actually believe or say that the Ukraine war is really Joe Biden's war. That he was behind it all, uh, because he wants to harm Russia with it. This is sort of what many people actually believe. But listen to this. This is from the General Kellogg here. Uh, it says President Biden's poor leadership as commander in chief, a weak national security team, and national security policies combined with a complete misunderstanding of Russia, Putin, Ukraine, and NATO established conditions that led Putin to order the February 2022 invasion of Ukraine and conduct an overt war of aggression in defiance of the United States and the international community. Early in his administration, Biden designated climate change as the main threat to U.S. national security. Biden's orders led to the precipitous U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, an epic foreign policy disaster that did enormous damage to American credibility and global security. The president needlessly antagonized and alienated important U.S. allies, especially Israel and Saudi Arabia, and resumed President Obama's foolhardy efforts to appease Iran in the absurd hope of making it a U.S. partner for peace in the Middle East. And yeah, and it goes on like this. So yeah, it's like he even talks about some of these weak statements almost right before the invasion. I mean, you were supposed to make very, very strong statements. You can
Yeah.
always compromise later. You can always make a deal later. But at that point in time, you needed to make a super
I
strong statement.
I very
But he didn't.
carefully watched both of President Biden's press conferences before the invasion, and it was interesting. He was pretty cogent for what he is now, but Biden did make that statement. Well, if it's a small incursion, whatever
Oh yeah.
that would be, we're not going to react. And it was very odd, but. To underscore your point, Mr. Robert C. O'Brien, who was Trump's last national security advisor, he was national security advisor from 2019 to 2021. He wrote a piece called The Return of Peace Through Strength, Making the Case for Trump's Foreign Policy. And it's in the July-August 2024 edition of Foreign Affairs, the prestigious Foreign Affairs magazine. And what he says in there is rather striking because he accuses Biden of slow walking the aid to Ukraine, of
Yeah.
bottlenecking and not really following through on the aid to Ukraine and actually says if Ukraine had been strengthened earlier as it should have been, this war would not have gone the way it did. So the thing is, the people that, and O'Brien is very likely to be the national security advisor in a new administration or Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense. I'm told that he's being considered for one of those two posts. So here's a guy who's going to be running a huge part of the government under Trump if he gets reelected. And this guy is saying that Biden did not do the job of supporting Ukraine promptly and correctly, which is interesting, right?
Yeah.
He's not saying we're going to pull out of NATO, we're going to do this. He says peace through strength. Well, strength is not dissolving NATO, and this is Trump's guy, Robert O'Brien.
Yeah.
This is Trump's guy.
And it goes on. In May of 2021, 9 months before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the Biden administration waived U.S. sanctions on the construction of the Russian Nord Stream 2 pipeline, a decision that garnered bipartisan opposition. Holy cow. I mean, imagine what the Russians must have been what the Russians must have been talking about at the time. They probably said, "Look, these Americans are weak. The Europeans are weak. We got assets everywhere. They're gonna forgive us. We're gonna take Ukraine in a blitzkrieg style operation, and we're gonna manage the fallout. The West is not really going to do anything because they're sending all these super weak signals. This is the time." This is the time to grab the big prize.
Let me read you the headline from the BBC. 19 May 2021, Nord Stream 2, Biden waives U.S. sanctions on Russian pipeline. The Biden administration has waived sanctions on a company building a controversial gas pipeline between Russia and Germany. The U.S. also lifted sanctions on the executive, an ally of Russia's Vladimir Putin, who leads the firm behind the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. So they had the company that was laying the pipeline, we had sanctions on the executive of the company, and we took the sanctions off of that. So look at what Biden's doing for Russia.
Yeah.
He claims to be against Russia. So Trump is the guy that puts the sanctions on that and on the executive. Biden's the guy that comes and takes it away. So
Yeah.
Biden's the anti-Russian guy?
Yeah. And it's like again with this whole issue of NATO expansion and maybe membership for Ukraine. Now, of course, when you read this text by General Kellogg, you understand that he does want Ukraine he does want Ukraine at some point to become a member of NATO, but the timing is really important. Or back then, it was even more important. When to do it. It should happen in stages, not rush it, not make empty promises that create unnecessary friction and pressure. It says here it made no sense to allude to supporting eventual NATO membership for Ukraine at that time, as this would require a unanimous vote of NATO members, which at the time was highly unlikely. Ukraine also needed to meet stiff membership requirements and so on and so forth. Biden, yeah, and so basically what we saw was empty words coming from Biden and some others. They were talking about a NATO membership for Ukraine, but they don't necessarily wanted that. They just said it at the wrong time. And so Kellogg explains it should have happened in stages. You should have had some security partnership and take things slowly, not cause instability. This would have been the smart way of doing it. And many people who understand this type of strategy, they would agree with that. But by just blurting it out, yeah, we're going to do it soon, or implying we're going to do it soon, NATO membership, yay. This was kind of the wrong move at the wrong time. It was just empty words. So if you really wanted a NATO membership for Ukraine, you should have done it the smart way, not the way Biden and these other guys acted. And so then Biden was prepared Biden was prepared to give up on Ukraine after the February 22 invasion and offered to evacuate Zelensky from Kiev. Zelensky rejected the offer, famously replying, "The fight is here. I need ammunition, not a ride." And that was an absolutely key moment if you understand that conflict at the time. If Zelensky had just left, a lot of Ukrainian structures would have collapsed, especially military structures could have collapsed, and this would have benefited. This would have greatly benefited the Russians. So that offer from Biden was like this offer from Biden was like a poisoned sort of offer. This was like a poisoned gift. Oh, we're gonna put you we're gonna put you to Virginia or Europe or London. You're gonna have some meaningless exile government and blah blah blah. Ukraine could have collapsed, but Zelensky stayed. Again, this is not what activists out there think about. This is not what they expected. Just like if Zelensky had accepted this offer, Ukraine would have been done. And Ukraine would have been done, and the Russians actually would have won.
Absolutely, absolutely. Because if the leader abandons his post, it demoralizes the whole. What the leader did, what Zelensky did at that moment, knowing they were hunting him, they were coming to assassinate him, they were going to kill the whole Ukrainian government. And by staying there in the capital and defending, and you heard many military analysts, I heard it on Fox News, I heard it on other news channels, they had these military analysts on saying Kiev might not last the weekend. That first
Yeah.
weekend when they were surrounding it, the Russians were coming down from the north behind it. They had dropped paratroops. They tried to seize that airfield that was just on the other side of the river, behind Kiev. On the same side as most of the city. The city's on the west bank of the river. But it was just a catastrophe, right, for the Russians not to take that city right away, because that's what they were going for. They were going for a decapitation attack. And of course, did Biden rush to send aid to Ukraine in February, in March?
Mm.
No. In February and March of 2022, the United States sent nothing to Ukraine. In April, they started talking about it. I know some of the activists that were Republicans who went to Congress and said, it was the Republicans in Congress, we need to do something. We need to help Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, like
Back then.
if
It
Zelensky
didn't come from the administration.
if Zelensky had left, the Europeans would have then completely abandoned Ukraine. They would have said, "Okay, it's collapsing. That's it. It's done. It's nothing we can do." Germany, France, whatever. It's nothing we can do. It's over. The Russians gonna take this thing in a week or so. Let's just try to figure it out what we're gonna do and how long we need to wait until we can resume the gas trade with the Russians, basically. This was the situation. So this was the offer by the Biden administration. I mean, do activists realize this? Do they understand what this is? What this actually means? It's like I mean, I get it. People are scared. People are frustrated, and there's people in politics. They will talk to you and tell you what you want to hear, tell you or reinforce what you heard on the internet. But there's so much the stuff that's going on is really really different. So you shouldn't become sort of a crowd to be managed. A crowd that is treated like children sometimes. They tell you what you want to hear, but the reality is really really different.
Yeah, yeah, and that's the point. I think in this situation that we're in today, there is the difference between the narratives and the rhetoric and the actual truth and the reality. And my frustration is that people do not separate the two. They don't seem to know enough. They're not
Exactly.
following events closely enough, and they're listening to nonsense, and they don't even know it's nonsense.
Yeah, it's like, and then of course, Kellogg, he is explaining what a peace deal would actually look like, because a lot of people are very confused about that. They say, well, the Russians are making, the Russians are making these offers. They want to negotiate, and they have all these reasonable, nice conditions. But if you look at it, these conditions offered are surrender. The Russians want to grab, or the Russians want to claim the territories forever, and they want to demilitarize the rest of Ukraine. But the Russians, of course, they want to keep rebuilding their military, reinforce, get ready to try again, and many other silly conditions. And also, the Russians, they want a complete stop of all sanctions. This is ludicrous. So then Kellogg actually explains what a realistic peace deal would look like. It would be harsh on the Russians. They would have to pay for the reconstruction of Ukraine. And still then, even if you kind of, reduce some of the sanctions a bit, we know what Kellogg is thinking, what he thinks of these pipelines. And we know what he thinks of this energy dependence. So even if there's a deal, it won't be the same situation as before, where all this gas is being traded. So it must be a deal that is that's harsh on the Russians. And he explains some of the details when he says that there will be some territories. He thinks some territories will be lost for Ukraine, but not forever. There must be a mechanism of possibly regaining these territories in the future at a time, most likely, when Putin is no longer head of state. So this is kind of an elegant way of doing this. You just you get a deal now, and then you keep building on top of that deal. So you go gradually, and eventually there may be a regaining of all of these territories in the future. So this is how a professional would explain it. This is like how a professional would explain it. There's other ways, there's other possible peace deals to be made, but this is not what activists out there think about. This is completely different. Very, very different.
Yeah, yeah. So anyway, we've kind of talked about this this business of the debate and the foreign policy aspects in the party politics in America. I don't know where it's going, to be honest, because the election's very unclear to me, and I'm very shocked that the Democrats seem to be continuing to want Biden in, which doesn't make any sense. There's got to be some kind of strategy involved in going with Biden, and that Biden is not just a placeholder, but he's almost like a bowling pin. He's been set up to be knocked down in some way. I have a kind of intuition that there's something fishy about them pushing him for a second term. And it could be his wiliness of having Harris the vice president. That's kind of a funny comic aside, but it's not. It may not be the real picture. And any final remarks? We're just about at the end of our time now.
Not really. I think I covered most of my notes here. I had some additional notes. There's just a little bit of extra stuff about the WikiLeaks Assange thing that happened when now Assange he walked free instead of getting extradited and put on trial in a proper way. We talked about this case at length. People can check out the previous episode on Assange and also the previous hackers, the famous names. Guys from Germany associated with the Chaos Computer Club. Some of these people then sold secrets or sold stolen information to the KGB. They ended up dead in the woods. Crazy stuff. People can check out this episode. I got an article on Candor Intel, candorintel.com, where I add a little bit more to this and explain why this organization could not function if you have non-experts running this sort of leaking website, people who came from an IT background. And especially in the case of Julian Assange, he is essentially or he is essentially a standard standard 2-bit activist. Just he never published anything substantial, never published anything original, no original thought, most baseline stuff. And at some point, a mentally unstable soldier gave him a bunch of data and turned him famous, and then it became a political issue. Apparently the Americans didn't want him anymore because it's too much hassle, especially during
Well,
election
who
year.
knows what he might have on the administration?
Yeah, or it's just like, no. At first, he was the darling of the left. The Democrats, they loved him. The press loved him when he was useful for them because of his opposition to the Bush wars and in Afghanistan and Iraq. So they thought, oh, this is a great opportunity. We have some leaker, and this helps us in the elections. But then, he leaked other stuff. Then the left started to hate him. And some of these weirdo guys, like I think Roger Stone became sort of a focus of attention. What was he really doing with Assange? Nobody quite knows. And so I think nobody really wanted him anymore. They just wanted this thing to go away.
Hmm. Well, anyway, we're at the end of our time. I'm Jeff Nyquist. This has been Friends and Enemies with Alex Benesch, my co host in Germany. And I want to thank you for joining us. And we'll be back next week with another edition.